May 1940. A road east of Sedan, in northern France. Late morning. A French infantry company is dug in along the tree line, waiting. They can hear artillery in the distance, and further off, engines. Then, without warning, a sound arrives before the plane. Does. A wail starting low, somewhere behind the clouds, climbing into a scream that fills the whole valley. The men in the trenches do not fire. They do not move. Their divisional commander, General Edouard Ruby, will later write that his infantry simply stopped firing and went to the ground, dazed by the shriek of the dive bombers. Entire regiments broke that afternoon before a single bomb had fallen. This is the story of a wind-powered Siren bolted onto a slow, ugly airplane that terrified entire armies. The airplane was the Junkers Ju-87, the Germans called IT Sturzkampfflugzeug, the diving combat aircraft, and shortened that unwieldy word to Stuka. It was slow. It was ugly. Its wings bent down at the roots, like the wings of a hunting bird, and its landing gear did not retract. In a straight fight with a modern fighter, it stood no chance. It was, on paper, an unremarkable machine. But the man who fell in love with it, the man who dragged it through every objection in the German High Command and made it the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, was Ernst Udet. 62 victories in the First World War. Only Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, himself, had scored more. After the armistice, Udet drifted into stunt flying and barnstorming across Europe, then into Hermann Göring's rebuilding Luftwaffe, and in Par. The autumn of 1933, he crossed the Atlantic to attend an American air show. At the Cleveland Air Races, Udet watched two American Curtiss Hawk biplanes carrier planes flown by the United States Navy perform simulated dive bombing runs. They pointed their noses at the ground, held the line, and released their bombs at almost point-blank altitude. Udet had never seen anything like it. He came home and told Göring that this was the future of ground warfare, not bombing from 3 miles up and hoping, but bombing from 300 feet and never missing. By 1935, Junkers had a prototype. It crashed during testing that same year, killing its pilot. But the program survived. By 1936, small numbers of production Ju-87s were quietly deployed to Spain, flying under the flag of the Condor Legion in support of Francisco Franco's nationalists. The Spanish Civil War was the Luftwaffe's laboratory. Germans tested tactics, they tested formations, and they tested what a diving airplane could do to men who had never seen one. But the Siren, the sound that would define the Stuka in the memory of every soldier who lived through 1940, was not yet standard on the plane. The 1st of September, 1939. Fall Weiss Case White. Before dawn. The Luftwaffe crossed the Polish border in numbers no European air force had ever assembled. Stukas led the way. In the first 3 days of the invasion, they cratered railway junctions, obliterated bunkers, and hunted horse-drawn Polish artillery columns from the Kolns. Sky. Over the 6 weeks that followed, the Ju-87 units flew nearly 6,000 combat sorties. They lost 31 aircraft, 31 against a rate of destruction the Polish army could not comprehend. It was during those weeks that the Sirens began to appear. And here is the first thing most people get wrong about them. They were not standard equipment. Look at the original factory handbooks for the Ju-87 bone, and B-2, the versions that flew the invasion of Poland and the invasion of France, and you will not find the Siren mentioned. It was an optional module, fitted at the discretion of the squadron, 2 small propellers, each about 27 inches across, bolted to the front of the fixed landing gear fairings. When the Stuka nosed over into its dive, the airflow spun the propellers, and propellers turned the hollow metal casing into a scream. The Germans called them Jericho Trompeten, trumpets of Jericho, named after the walls that fell to sound in the book of Joshua. It was not a joke. They believed it. The 10th of May, 1940, Fall Gelb Case Yellow, Germany's assault on the West, began before sunrise, and the Stukas were everywhere. Above the Ardennes, they cleared the way for Heinz Guderian's tanks. Above the Meuse crossings at Sedan, they broke French artillery positions bunker by bunker. But the most famous single Stuka strike of the entire war happened somewhere else, at a Belgian fortress called Eben Emael. Eben Emael was supposed to be impregnable, built in the 1930s into the limestone bluffs north of Liège. It commanded every road and rail line into central Belgium. It had underground galleries, retractable gun cupolas, and a garrison of more than 1,000 men. On the morning of the 10th of May, German glider troops landed silently on its roof, and Stukas screamed down onto its gun positions, one after another, all through the day. Within 24 hours, the strongest fortress in Europe had to surrender. The Maginot Line, France's whole northern defensive wall, could now be bypassed to the north. The war in the West was, in effect, already lost. Down below, the wail from the sky was not just a noise anymore. It was a signal that meant the world was about to end. General Ruby's account from the retreat, infantry cowering in trenches, dazed and unable to fire, was repeated across the entire front. Whole columns of French soldiers dropped their rifles when they heard the sound. Refugees on the roads abandoned their carts and threw themselves into the ditches on the beaches of Dunkirk in late May and early June. British troops waiting for evacuation described the sound the same way. Not the sound of a plane, the sound of a predator. By the end of June, France had fallen, and the Jericho trumpet was, for one brief summer, the most feared sound in Europe. And here is the part most documentaries never mention. The men who flew the Stuka hated the Siren. The early versions of the device could not be switched off. Once the aircraft was moving quickly enough through the air, the propellers spun, which meant a Ju-87, cruising home from a mission, trailed a constant, low, thin wail behind it for hours. Pilots reported it drove them half mad on long flights. The Sirens also created drag. A Stuka fitted with them was between 10 and 20 miles per hour slower than one without. An aircraft that was already too slow to escape a modern fighter, that was a lethal handicap. And in tight turns, or during the vicious pullout from a dive at 6 times the force of gravity, the Sirens sometimes sheared off entirely and disappeared into the slipstream. Some squadrons removed them, others improvised. Pilot Friedrich Lang of Sturzkampfgeschwader too remembered his men fitting homemade wooden whistles to the bombs themselves, small tubes that produced a shriek as the ordnance fell through the air. The sound was different. The effect on the enemy was the same. In fact, historians now suspect that the phrase Jericho trumpet may have referred first to those bomb whistles and only later transferred to the airframe sirens. Ju-87 pilot Hans Problem, Georg Wilhelm Michon, said as much in a post-war interview. Inside the Luftwaffe itself, the line between the two devices had blurred. Even Ernst Udet's role in the aircraft's creation, so often told as a tidy legend, is mostly myth. The Junkers Ju-87 was already on the drawing board before he ever set foot in Cleveland. But he did save the program from cancellation more than once, and he did make dive bombing the central doctrine of the Luftwaffe, and for that alone, he owned the Stuka's story, whether he wanted it or not. But the story was about to turn on him. The 13th of August, 1940. Adlertag, Eagle Day. The official opening of Germany's aerial campaign against Britain. The plan was simple in outline. Wave after wave of Stukas would cross the English Channel and hammer the Royal Air Force into the ground, cratering runways, wrecking radar towers, and doing to Britain in a week what they had done to Poland in a month. The plan had worked in Spain. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It did not work here. Waiting for the Ju-87s were Spitfires and Hurricanes, faster, better armed, and critically vectored onto their targets by a chain of coastal radar stations that could see the German formations forming up over France long before they arrived. The Spitfires caught the Stukas at the bottom of their dives, at the exact moment they were slowest and most vulnerable, pulling out of a vertical drop with the pilot half blacked out from G-force. They slaughtered them. On the 18th of August, over the airfields of southern England, more than a dozen Ju-87s were destroyed or written off in a single afternoon. The Royal Air Force would later name it the hardest day. Whole Stuka squadrons ceased to exist. Within a starved week, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring pulled the Ju-87 units off the Channel front entirely. The wind-powered Siren, the wailing terror that had cleared the roads of Poland and France, could not save an airplane the moment the enemy stopped running. That is the truth about the Jericho trumpet. In the end, it was never really a weapon of grappus war. It was a weapon of surprise. Read the diaries and interviews of French, Belgian, and Polish soldiers who survived the first months of 1940, and a pattern emerges. The first Stuka attack a man ever lived through was the one that stayed with him for the rest of his life. The second was still terrifying, but by the fifth, the sixth, the 10th, the wail became information. It told a soldier how many seconds he had to reach a ditch and how far to jump. A Belgian teenager who ran from building to building in Terneuzen, May of 1940, told an interviewer decades later that he had never forgotten the sound. But by 1943, thousands of men across Europe had learned to hear the wail, count 5, and hit the dirt. Calmly, automatically, the way you flinch at a train horn. Fear has a shelf life. The Luftwaffe learned it too late. By 1943, the Jericho trumpet was almost never fitted. The Ju-87 soldiered on in other roles as a tank buster on the Eastern Front, where the ace, Hans Ulrich Rudel, would claim more than 500 Soviet tanks with a cannon-armed variant called the Kanonenvogel, and as a night raider harassing Allied lines after the Normandy landings. But the wail that had ended armies in 1940 was gone. In its place, the whistle of the falling bomb. And then, silence. And Ernst Udet, the ace who had built the Luftwaffe around dive bombing, the man whose name is on every telling of this story, did not live to see the end of the war he had helped begin. On the 17th of November, 1941, in his Berlin apartment, exhausted, disgraced by a losing air war he could no longer control, blamed by Göring for every Luftwaffe failure, Udet shot himself. The Nazi regime told the German public he had died testing a new aircraft. The Jericho trumpet was already going quiet. The trumpets of Jericho, in the book of Joshua, brought down the walls of a city. But when Joshua's priests sounded them a second time, and a third, the walls stayed standing. Sound alone cannot break stone. It cannot break a trained soldier. It can only break the ones who have not yet heard it. So do you think the Jericho trumpet was a stroke of psychological warfare genius, or just a gimmick that only ever worked on people who had never heard it before? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them, and the debate on these questions is honestly half the reason I make these videos. If you enjoyed this story, if you like the ones nobody else on YouTube seems to tell, hit the like button. It sounds small, but it tells the algorithm to push this video to more people who love this kind of history and honestly That is the only way channels like this one grow. Because next time, we are crossing to the other side of the Eastern Front to a Soviet aircraft that the Germans came to fear so much they gave it a name of their own. Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. It was armored so heavily that machine gun fire ricocheted off its belly. It flew straight through anti-aircraft flak and kept coming. It hunted panzers in numbers the Luftwaffe could not stop. And when Stalin needed to remind his own factory workers what was at stake, he told them the plane was as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. Subscribe so that story lands in your feed the day it drops. Thanks for watching.